Hello and welcome to this webinar on Neo4j Bloom. This is a graph data exploration and visualization tool that's been offered by Neo4j. We released it last year, and we've been making steady progress on the product side. So I'm excited to share with you all the latest and greatest that we have going on with this particular product. I am Anurag Tandon, as has been mentioned. I am in the product management team and have responsibility for this particular product. So with that, let's begin. And as usual, as is usual with these webinars, there's always a mixed group of people. Some of you would be really familiar with Neo4j. Some may be very new to us. Some may be very new to the graph database world as it is. And so I'll spend literally only a couple minutes, talking about graph databases, the role of Neo4j, and then we'll talk about Bloom and what's going on with this. And I invite you to check out content that we have on our website. There's tons of webinars, tons of videos, and other material that you can peruse and learn more about Neo4j, our customers, and what we do. So with that, you'll hear the term graph a lot today. And if I can proceed, this is not what we're going to talk about. So this, in Neo4j's terms, is not a graph. It's a chart of data, and very useful. And you obviously can have different representations of data. But what we're talking about today in terms of a graph is something that looks more like this. This is my graph. So in the bottom, you can see me, a crude representation of me, and things that I am then connected to. So we refer to these things as nodes. Like I myself am a node, and I'm a father of, so I have a relationship to my children. I have two kids, a daughter and a son. I work at Neo4j. I am married to my wife, Rimi, and we had a traditional Indian wedding, so that's why you see that icon. I am from India, as you can probably tell now, and I love cricket, both playing and watching. And then I also like to watch movies and shows. In fact, sometimes binge watch more than I should. And then I live in the US state of Virginia. I don't know if people can tell by that map if that's the state of Virginia. And then I drive a car that doesn't look like the car that you're seeing on the picture here. But basically, this is a graph of me and things that I'm connected to via relationships. And that, in essence, is what Neo4j is all about: is connections in data. And as you see more and more of data being brought in by systems and things that we're using, more and more technologies, things like IoT, blockchain. You hear all of these buzzwords: AI, data science, and whatnot. It's basically all about getting more and more data connected to more and more data points connected to one another. And so here are some examples that you can see on the screen: networks of people, somebody knowing somebody else, and the classic social network example of Facebook or LinkedIn or what have you. But then you can also have networks within the organization: employees, customers, suppliers, partners, and so on. Then you have networks of business processes, or graphs of business processes, how things relate to one another, what the steps are of a process, and so on. Trying to do a supply chain, trying to do a payment network, and so on. Then there are knowledge networks that are connecting lots of different kind of content together. And then the classic electronic networks, in telecommunications, cellular, internet, and so on. So as more and more data is available, more and more connections are available as well between those data points. And that's essentially the kind of problem of connecting data together, which is what Neo4j is here to solve. And this is something that actually we started long ago, many years ago, and came up with the the labeled property graph model idea. It's something that we evolved towards. It was initially just a property graph, and then we introduced labels on top of it. But in this particular instance, you can see there are two people. Those are nodes that are connected to each other. So Dan and Anne are connected to each other because Dan is married to Anne. Dan also lives with Anne. Anne owns a car that Dan drives. And so you can see all of these relationships. So you have nodes, you have relationships. Each of these things have properties associated with them. So Dan and Anne have properties of the birthday. Dan has a Twitter handle. The relationships themselves can also have properties. So Dan and Anne were married together back in July of 2005. Dan has started driving this Volvo since January 10th, 2011. So these relationships can have properties as well. And then the way you distinguish some of these nodes from one another is through labels. So two of the nodes are person nodes, so we can tag nodes with labels, and one of the nodes is a car node. And of course, in a real life, these models can get really complex. You can have many different labels on a particular node. You can have many relationships that connect a pair of nodes, and so on and so forth. Things can be connected to many different things. This is obviously a very simplified way of representing that. But it's going to be useful in our conversation as we go along. Neo4j is now, we want to position ourselves as the graph company because we have had a lot of investment, a lot over the years in graphs, and have been really adopted very well. We've been blessed with the adoption that we've gotten over the years and so you can see some of the numbers on the screen. I'm not going to read all of them out loud, but now we are about 250 plus employees. We had a funding round closed of $80 million late last year. And that raised our total, that basically doubled our total funding to 160 million or so. We have more than 300 enterprise customers, small, medium, large enterprises. You can see over half of them are over $1 billion in revenue. Lots of partners, lots of community uptake, meetups, events, and so on. And you can see some customers and partners listed there. Really, the way to think about ourselves as a graph company is to be able to offer everybody who connects with the graph something that we can offer. So in essence, that is the Neo4j Graph platform. The database you can see is in the center of this picture. That's Neo4j. And Neo4j is suited for both graph transaction kind of operations as well as graph analytic operations. And then what we offer to the enterprise or to any organization is all kinds of capability that is not just inside the database around transactions and analytics, but also around the database in terms of the tooling and ways of connecting to the database that we can provide. So obviously applications connect to the database through drivers and APIs. I'm going to go anti-clockwise here. And then we want to offer something to all the different kinds of users, all the different kinds of touch points you may want to have with the database. So developers and administrations need tooling for that. You need data integration to bring data into Neo4j and take data out. You want to be able to deploy the database anywhere you want, on-prem, on the cloud, even provide database as a service. That's something that we're working on. Analytics tooling for data analysts and data scientists. And then something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is discovery and visualization for business users, non-technical users, and getting them take a lot of value out of the database. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is discovery and visualization. So a few years ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, we did a survey around graph visualization. And if you look, back to, or think back to, early on in this conversation today, the slides that I had, they were all showing pictures of graphs, right? Those are visual tools meant to showcase what the graph data is all about. And in fact, the best way to represent a graph is by drawing it, right? It's that classic whiteboard. Get on the whiteboard, draw your model, explain what the model is all about, what is in your data. And so the graph visualization is a great way to represent what's going on inside the database, and people use it for all kinds of purposes: thinking tool, a communication tool, an interactive and exploration tool, and so on and so forth. And there are many different kinds of ways in which you can visualize information graphs in Neo4j with Neo4j. And I've represented them here as a spectrum. So on the left-hand side of the spectrum is are tools that are more for the non-technical users, require very little technical expertise to get up and running with it, and really designed more for exploration, intimate interactions with your graph, deployments that are maybe at a smaller scale, few users, small team, departments, 50, 100 users, something, in that range. And on the right-hand side, you see visualization toolkits that could be really intensive, could be more focused towards the developer audience who are actually creating these applications for mass consumption across departments, across the enterprise, for even public use for many users. And so these are more technically involved because you really want to tailor the experience that you provide with these visual tools in mind. But then they end up being more publishing and consumption focused, rather than exploration. And then you have things in the middle that are around graph visualization solutions. We have lots of excellent partners that provide these capabilities. Linkurious is a couple that are mentioned there. There are many others, and they are catering to not just Neo4j but other graph models and other graph other sources which you want to visualize as a graph. Offer lots of features and capabilities, but then are heavier in terms of getting started, and because it's obviously more than Neo4j that you need at that point. And then also classic BI tools like Tableau and Qlik and others that want to represent data not just as a graph visualization, but also other visualization types, and then even things like dashboards and reports and tailored views of how you want to see the data organized. So with that in mind, of course, our focus today is Neo4j Bloom. It's the thing on the left-hand side, provided by Neo4j, exclusively optimized for Neo4j, only works with Neo4j. And we like to show a set of capabilities that it provides in this fashion. So what is different about Neo4j Bloom? Let me start there, and then what's more common about Neo4j Bloom. So different in terms of what Neo4j Bloom provides that other tools haven't done as much, is this idea of a perspective. So Neo4j Bloom is able to provide to you different business views on the graph, departmental views, or views that require you to hide data from certain user types. A new experience all built around search. So a near natural language search. It's not fully free text search like Google, but aims to get closer to that near natural language search mechanism that we could offer. And I'll talk about that in a second, a little bit more. And those are, in my mind, two things that are very unique about Neo4j Bloom and the experience that we want to provide to the audience. And then there's the whole idea of visualization, which is very common. Obviously, we're talking about lots of visualization tools on the last slide. We talked about, so what's common is obviously being able to represent data as a graph visual. But with Neo4j Bloom, we've really taken advantage of the GPU that modern machines and modern hardware offer to be able to show you lots and lots of data on the screen. So high performance physics, high performance rendering, then providing an exploration experience that allows you to work directly with the graph. Because that's obviously you don't want to see static content. You want to be able to touch, feel, and explore it to make more sense of it. Inspection at a detail level for your nodes and relationships, also ability to browse from one to the other, and then be able to create, do some lightweight editing of your graph in terms of creating some nodes, connecting nodes with relationships, correcting data that you may see as not being correct. And to drill into a couple of those aspects a little bit more, here's an idea of a Bloom perspective. So we were talking a little bit about models early on. Here is a conceptual model of a financial services graph. In this case, you have a customer at the center of the graph, and the customer has different accounts that they have with a financial institution. There are transactions here. There's also customer demographic information like their address and their phone number and their social security number. And so it's a very simplified graph, again, just for illustration. But if you think about perspectives, you might have somebody who can see all of this data, or you might have somebody who is in customer marketing and doesn't need to see the transactional level detail, doesn't need to see anything that is protected, like the social security number, for privacy reasons. So that might be a perspective that you may want to create from the same graph. You may have transaction analysts who don't really want to see the customer specific detail, but are analyzing things more in aggregate or more anonymously. For example, just transactions between different accounts. You may have a bank division perspective where people are restricted to just looking at bank information, but not credit card information or loan information. And so there are these different views that you can create from the same graph by way of these perspectives. And here's a look at how these perspectives get created, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. But really, what we're trying to do with these perspectives is that we are able to categorize raw entities that you may have in your graph. So if you have labels in your graph, you have these labels attached to different node types, or the labels are really used to create these different node types. You can categorize these node types and labels into categories. Those categories you can color code, you can assign icons to them, you can hide certain nodes that haven't been categorized at all. You can choose which relationships should be exposed for this particular perspective. And then you can then choose which properties should be available. And then finally, you can restrict who has access to that particular perspective based on their roles in the organization. So that's what the purpose of the perspective is. And then in terms of graph search, I talked about the near natural language search, so that you are able to search on a few different things from the graph. And the search definitely takes into account your indexes that you may apply on the graph, but is also able to do full text search across the graph if you have that capability. So with Bloom, in this particular example, what you will see, and I'm not sure if my mouse is visible for you or not, but you can see at the top let's say on the right-hand side, the top picture, there's a label match. So I put in something in the search box, and I can, what Bloom will do is will match that against labels that we find in the data, or categories that you have created in the perspective, or against values that exist in the data, index values that exist in different properties in your graph. So it will do searches against these things. But then when you have a more complex phrase that you have put in the search box, Bloom is also able to identify from it different entities, different categories, and even relationships that you may have entered in that search box. As well as if you have any saved queries that you have put into the perspective. So for example, the thing that says account holder with card account search phrase, that is a saved query that you could save, and you could search against that as well. And then finally, full text search as well. So again, in terms of the demo, which is coming shortly, we will take a more detailed look at some of these things, but just to introduce this to you early on. Here's the user interface of Bloom, which again, we'll look at the demo. And in the user interface, you will see that there's a search box. There are different category colors and icons that define the category. You can visualize and explore just using this interface, pan, zoom, select, etc. And then you can also see a browser for properties, an area for editing and browsing properties. So with that, let's take a look at a demo of the product. So I'm going to switch over to Bloom. And I've decided to do a live demo, and that's always tricky in these webinars. So hopefully the demo gods are going to be nice to me today. So first of all, what we see in this interface, in fact, this is actually my Chrome browser, I believe. Yep, I'm running Bloom in this Chrome browser. I have the perspectives that I can look at. So let's take a look at that. So here's a toggle I have. I can switch between these different perspectives that may be available to me. I've taken on the persona of a fraud investigator, and this fraud investigator has access to all of the data in the graph. And so here are my categories. So I have an account holder category that is mapped to an account holder label. I can choose other labels to assign if it makes sense. So for example, in the case of addresses, I've chosen multiple labels that all roll up to address in this particular perspective view. And I can do that also here. For example, card accounts, there are multiple kinds of accounts, cards that are accounts. So I've done that here. I can choose which properties to be included, excluded, or which ones should act as a caption for the particular icon. I can choose which relationship types I want to exclude, and I can create these saved searches that are available to me, and then I can share this particular perspective with different roles. So if I have different roles, I can go and pick them here. So that's the idea of the perspective. Let's go ahead and do some searches. So in terms of the search, I can type in different phrases. So as soon as I type in 3 characters, I can start seeing matches. So if I type in ACC, you can see it matched up with bank account, card account, account holder, and the relationship has bank account. So it's basically a contains kind of a search. And I can refine it further, or I can choose already from the already visible selections or the suggestions, I should say, which one am I interested in. So let's just do this one simply. And in this data set, I have several account holders. Of course, this is being a little slow. What Bloom does is it uses the GPU of the machine. And what also happens is when I'm doing a webinar or any kind of web conference, the GPU comes into play. And therefore, there's some contention that you'll see here, in terms of how it loads. And there we go. This one happened very quickly now. In fact, I can give it another try, clear the scene. And I'm taking one more risk with you guys. And this is the effect that I was hoping for, because that's where the Neo4j Bloom name comes from, is that this force-directed visualization loads from the center and looks like a flower that's blooming out. So here we go. We have 4,000 or so account holders in this data, and I can look at all of them, of course, at this scale. When I'm zoomed out, these are all dots. And as I zoom in, you will see that there's more fidelity that starts happening in this visualization. So now I can start seeing some icons. And in fact, if I continue zooming in, you'll start seeing captions and names start popping up. So what I can do is I can click on any one of these. Let me pick Wiki Lefebvre's here, and I double clicked on it on that particular node, and I can see this person's details. I can see relationships that this person has to other nodes, and I can also see the nodes that it has relationships to in terms of its neighbors and some details about them. And I can continue like my exploration this way. I can double click on this particular node and see that detail, and that node also shows up here now. And I can do it this way, or I can essentially select just Wiki and right click and then decide that I want to expand on this person and get the details of this person. Or I can also do this at a little bit more aggregate level, or I can select a bunch of these nodes and decide that I want to expand them, but then I want to first maybe dismiss other nodes that are available on the screen because that's just too much clutter that I don't want to work with. And in this case, I want to expand these nodes. And you can see that as things are coming together, it's a force-directed visualization, and all the nodes adjust to take space according to the forces that are going to come up in this case. And these different colors indicate what these different things are. So some are account holders and addresses and phone numbers, and you can see the things that are selected. The legend highlights them here as well. I can select from the legend, so I can select all the phone numbers, for example, or I can select all the addresses, and I can decide I want to do something with them, maybe dismiss them, dismiss other nodes, fit to selection, whatever the case might be. Or I can start trying to see if there are linkages between these different clusters, because as you can see, all of these things are disconnected from one another. This is a network of Elise. This is the network of the immediate closest network to Geraldine. Don't know how to say that name. But I can start seeing if there's any connection between this person and that person. So if I select those two, I can find the shortest path between them. And in this case, that shortest path goes through some other nodes. And if I want to just understand this particular path, with the path selected, I can dismiss everything else and then just focus my analysis or exploration on this particular path. So the way that these two people are connected are through a bunch of different other accounts. So there was a bank transfer that happened between these two accounts from this institution, and another bank transfer that happened between this institution and this institution through these two accounts, and then that connects to this particular person. So maybe this is a very benign kind of a path. There's nothing that's particularly happening here that catches my eye as a fraud investigator. But there are other things that I can do with the graph to understand if there's fraud that's happening. And in fact, in case of fraud, I'm going to clear that scene and start typing some patterns that might be interesting patterns for me to understand. So social security number is something that is very unique to an individual. So an account holder mapped to a social security number is a fine pattern. But an account holder that's mapped to a social security number that's also mapped to another account holder, that would be more of an interesting pattern to find. And in this case, I'm finding that there are some instances of this pattern existing in my data. So as I zoom out to make sure that I can see all of the data, there are in this case, 4 people connected to the same social security number. And in this case, 2, in this another case, 4, and so on. And it turns out that this is a particularly common fraudulent pattern that people may want to investigate. In fact, in the case of fraud, there is a term for it called fraud rings, and this is a good time to kind of go and explore our saved searches, because saved searches then allow a user to conduct a search or a query that is a little bit more complex than what you can just type in. So high risk individuals is a query that we have. This is a Cypher query. Cypher is the language that you use to query Neo4j. And if your users are not technical enough to write their own Cypher statements, or if they don't prefer to write to type in these statements over and over again in like another tool, they can use Bloom, because in Bloom you can really save these queries and you don't have to type them in over and over again. In fact, you can even parameterize these queries so that with the same search phrase, you can conduct many different queries. So in this example, high risk individuals is a static query. Let's just run it. And by just typing this much, I'm finding the search phrase of high risk individuals. I'm going to go ahead and run that. And you can see that there are some individuals that show up. But then I can do something similar with a parameterized query where it's not fully static, but I can say find me fraud rings. So there's fraud rings with greater than 2 members, 3 members, 4 members, 5 members, any number of members. Let me pick 3 members. And here are the individuals that are involved in fraud rings with greater than 3 members. And the way I can see that is if I expand the selection for them. Here, you can now visualize the rings. So all the red nodes are my people nodes. And here you have 4 individuals involved in this particular ring, another 4 over here, another 4 over here, over 6 here, right? And I can start exploring this particular ring and focusing on this to see what's going on. How are they connected to one another? In this case, some of these people are sharing the phone number. Some of these people are also sharing the social security number. They're all, some of them are also sharing these addresses. So it's a very good indicator to me that a fraud is happening. At which point I can go in and I can choose to inspect these particular people. And in fact, I can also flag them. I can go in and say, okay, I flagged this particular individual, and we'll have to take a look at all of the flagged individuals in some other system, maybe not in Bloom, but automate some way of, once I flag them, like a business process can take over and start identifying transactions that are happening by that individual so that they can either be declined or investigated in further detail. So that's how you would typically use Bloom in this particular context. Let's take an example of a different kind of a search phrase, that one that can look at some other data that exists in this particular data set. So here I have purchases from shop on date. In this case, there is a query. In fact, let me look at something simpler first. So purchases by login. So I have purchases by login. This is how you construct this particular search phrase. You give it something that the user will remember it by. Here's the query, and the dollar sign indicates that this is a parameter. The dollar login then goes in here. So that gets matched to the first name in this particular query. And then we allow a list of suggestions to show up for the user. And the suggestions are driven by the login label with the first name key. And so let's see this one in action. So if I want to purchase, I just type in this much, and I already see my 2 search phrases that match. I can choose this one, purchases by login. And so I have different individuals showing up. I haven't really qualified this search any further than this. Maybe I want to look for somebody that starts with J versus purchases by Jack. Okay, let's see what we find here. And what's interesting you'll see is that not only I'm getting the purchases by Jack search phrase, which is my saved query, but also Bloom is trying to identify that there might be some other pattern that might satisfy this. So it's recognizing purchases as the purchase category, ignoring the buy, and then as soon as I type in J, it's matching J with a bunch of property values that also exist in the data that matches people's names. So that's interesting, right? But in this case, let me just go this. So I purchases by Jack from this particular store. Maybe I want to find out if there are more purchases that happen, from this particular store. And here I'm going to run this other one. So purchases from, and the store that I'm interested in is this Messick, Jovic and Sons. And then maybe I want to pick on 2018, 02, 04. And then here I can see some other purchases that happened from the same store on the same date with different other logins. And this is another way that you can, build on the same graph and investigate and explore this in more detail. So I can continue looking at other kind of transactions that may have happened. In this case, there is nothing in this particular data set, but you can see how you can go from here. All right, let's switch back over to the presentation. Oops, going the other way. So a couple other things of note. How does Bloom get deployed? So Bloom is offered by Neo4j, works with Neo4j. So it depends on a Neo4j database. There are many different ways that you can set that up. We have a Neo4j desktop product that actually has enterprise edition of Neo4j shipped with it. You can use it for development purposes. You can set up your own instances of Neo4j database locally on your machine. It's a desktop install. And so you can have Neo4j running locally, and you can attach Bloom server to it and access Bloom through a client. The Bloom client works as a desktop client, and then shortly we're releasing it as a web client as well. I think it's probably useful at this point to talk a little bit about the history. So I mentioned earlier on in the call that in this webinar that we had launched Bloom last year. So last year was the first release of Neo4j Bloom. It was really meant to be a single user kind of a release where you have it's a desktop-based install. You install inside of Neo4j desktop, and you can connect it to a local instance of Neo4j, a server instance of Neo4j, a cluster of Neo4j, a cloud instance of Neo4j, any configuration you want. But really, from a user standpoint, it's a local install, and there was some sharing capability, but not a whole lot. And what we're coming up with now is a web browser-based version of Bloom. So Bloom available as a web client, which is what we have been looking at today. It's coming out shortly in this quarter. And with this configuration, you will be able to choose, do you want to set up a desktop-based client? Do you want to set up a web-based client? And what we're also releasing with it is this Bloom server concept. The Bloom server allows for sharing to be possible between users that might use it on the web or on the desktop, where these perspectives that we were talking about can be shared amongst users of the same role, or the people who want to perform the same kind of tasks. They can share these perspectives. And you can connect basically with this particular model now. You will be able to select to choose, do you want to use the desktop client, the web client, and then how you want to connect the desktop or the web client to a Bloom server attached to a Neo4j database in, locally or on a server somewhere in a cluster or in the cloud. So lots of flexibility available. With the Bloom web version, we will be supporting modern web browsers because of the GPU requirement, as well as the requirement that we have on HTML5 and some of the newer technologies that we're using in the interface. GPU is a technology we use to power the graph visualization, and most modern machines now have a GPU, and that is a requirement that Bloom has and has had. So that's something that you should just pay attention to as well. And then finally, with this web-based client that we're offering, you also have the ability to connect Bloom to other applications that you may have, and with these integrations that are now possible as well. So in this particular example, you see on the top, there's an application. This is more like a dashboard that you may have in your BI tool or some other application that you may use. This particular dashboard has multiple kinds of visuals. Here's a map visual. Here's a chart that you have. And in these visuals, you can have different data points. And these data points you may want to dig into in more detail. And when you want to do that, and when that data is supported through a graph database, you can pass in context. So from this particular dot on the map, in this example, I'm passing in some context into Bloom, the Bloom interface. It comes with an ID of that particular event that this is displaying, and then you can explore that event in more detail in Bloom. So that's this particular example that is being illustrated here. And with these integrations, we think Bloom can provide a lot of power to your analysts, to your business users who are trying to understand what's happening with a particular event, with a particular entity, or whatever context they may have for their particular use case. You can also control the perspectives that the business user or the non-technical user is going to be able to see when they pass in this particular link. And you can pass in the perspective alongside that link. And so therefore, we feel that with this web-hosted version of Bloom that we will be releasing shortly here, we can enable Bloom for use by these multiple user teams, even multiple teams in a department. You no longer need to have just a local install, although you can certainly choose to do it that way if you want to. And you can link Bloom from an external application and enable exploration, graph exploration use cases for business users. At the same time, allowing to choose which perspectives should be available to which roles in your organization. So with that, I'm just going to offer a couple of next steps and then see if you guys have any questions. There are more demos and details available on Bloom. There were a couple other webinars we did last year. Here's one listed on our webinars page on how to get started with Bloom. In this webinar, there are some more demos around specific pattern searches that you can conduct in Bloom. So I recommend you check that out. And then if you want to contact us for a Bloom trial and take it for a spin, there are, you have the contact us page on the Neo4j website. You can find your representative, Neo4j representative, if you don't know them, and they can hook you up with a trial of Bloom, and you can try it out and see what you think of the product.